afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Young, Access Services Director for the Library Services here at Lindenwood University. And I'm so thankful that all of you are here. For everybody viewing at home, we have probably about 20 people in the audience, and most are representatives of faculty here at Lindenwood. So pleased to have everybody here today. In this series, we invite faculty to choose a few books that have influenced their career path or their life story, or simply inspire them in some way. They have the creative freedom to interpret that invitation as they see fit, but with each installment of the series, I have personally learned something new about each professor or their passion or their research, and my hope is that you will too, and also maybe find some good books to read along the way. Today we are featuring two professors who are highly regarded by the library staff, Professor Gillian Parrish and Reverend Dr. Nicole Torbitsky. As for introductions, it's a bit of a faculty read series tradition to read a review from the highly credible website ratemyprofessor.com. So let's see what some students had to say about Professor Parrish. She's amazing, supportive, encouraging, and hilarious. She added excitement to the learning process. She loves what she does, and she tries to adapt to her students. She will go out of her way to help you find joy in writing and poetry. She's an absolutely incredible teacher. She ends up spending 5 times as long as she intends to grading student essays because she's so passionate. She cares about her students a ton and is just the bomb. Now, Nicole Torbitsky is a unique presenter because not only is she an assistant professor of religion, she also serves as a university chaplain. So a colleague of mine wrote for her, Nicole is instrumental in organizing events throughout campus that promote inclusion, spiritual growth, and leadership. She compassionately fosters conversations that empower staff and students alike to value campus-wide diversity. It's apparent in my interactions with Nicole that she enthusiastically researches to give her students the best learning environment and brings multiple perspectives, experiences, and approaches to her teaching.
Does that mean I don't have a rate my professor? Or are they all bad?
We want a conglomeration of a representation of everything, of all your facets that you do here. So without further ado, here we are.
So librarians should rule the world, I will say that. I think it would be good. They like helping people, they like books. I obviously like books. I'm an interdisciplinary thinker, so I am always reading 7 or 8 books. I'm going to talk from my notes because I have a headache, and this way there's a through line, which is my red pen. So I'm usually reading fiction and creative nonfiction for my classes, books on culture, which I'll get to that in a minute, and on teaching and learning. I am sparing you the geeky teaching and learning, but for one, John Dewey. We all love some John Dewey. I read in a way that crosses wires. My students here know we talk about that a lot, sparking creativity through crossing wires of things. I like to think about how writing's created and how I like to interview artists and see how they make things. So that kind of starts extending into how we're making our world. I like to read about organizational development. I like to read about social entrepreneurship. Next week I'm giving a conference presentation on like the 4th industrial revolution. It's coming for us. Automation and the 21st century skills that we need to get ahead of it. So kind of like, you'll see some of that in here, which is why I mentioned that. I brought a couple books at the last minute for the spring class that I'll be teaching. Neil Gaiman, Ocean at the End of the Lane. I think Charlene is teaching it online. Wonderful book. Briar Rose is a young adult book, Holocaust book, scaffolded on a fairy tale. So those are for the class. And then here is a plug for a speaker in March. We have a speaker coming, Kiz Johnson, who's going to be great. So come out in March, more on that later. I did my little book sales. Yes. I used to work at a bookstore, obviously. So I've talked about those. Okay, I did pick books that my 15-year-old self loved. So I want to just hold up those right now. Beloved, which we just read in class, you guys. And then Wide Sargasso Sea, which might be sacrificed, because I don't know that we have time to talk about it. And so those are 2 that I picked because of the beauty of the language, along with Engine Summer, a very obscure book. But sometimes I buy for friends and they never mention it again. So then like, we just won't go there. We won't talk about that. They didn't like it, but you're going to hear about it today. And then I picked a couple books that I really love the ideas in. And so I'll hold those up. Andy, we kind of talked about On Dialogue. David Bohm is one we'll talk about. And then this book, Unkindness, which I discovered not long ago, and it's just really interesting to spark conversations. And then a book that I kind of wish I had picked, but I haven't read it in a long time, but Pema Chodron, a book called When Things Fall Apart. And it's got some like mindfulness stuff that I'll talk about at the very end. Look, I didn't talk in my notes, but I've got the red pen. So we're chugging along. So what I realized when I had to think about all this together is that I'm interested in consciousness and culture and how those two things are a continuum. And they're not two things, actually. They're one thing that flows together. To kind of look at this kind of touches into teaching and learning because you're becoming something all the time, and that's a gradual process. And John Dewey will get there in a moment, but he talks about that. But each of us, the consciousness, each of us, and then the culture, which is all of us, it's happening through a process of accretion, of like layering, of selecting this, collecting that, rejecting this, rejecting that, collecting this, collecting that. And we often just lose sight of the fact that that's even happening, that process is happening. And so I'm just really excited at being in the middle, like thinking creatively, like this is an ongoing creation. Ourselves, our lives, and our culture. I did create a handout for you. I find it very hard to talk at people. I mean, I don't like doing it in class that much. I like to create discussions. So this thing might be fun. I tried to make it really reflective where it's, where these books and quotes from the books will hit your life. And you can think about it. You could do one of them. Some of them are designed as free writes. So just feel free to do that. You can even tune out. If you have a headache right now, you can tune out and just noodle on that. But to talk about this process of layering and accretion, this entire book on dialogue. So this guy is a physicist. Poets like to reference them because then they take us seriously, NASA engineers. But he, in his later life, just got really interested in communication, in culture, in how we talk and how we fail to talk. And so this book, he's interested in thinking, and he asks us to think about thinking. So instead of getting caught in the content of your thought and making it monolithic, you kind of start to look at how does that thought even happen? So I'm going to just dip in right here on page, let me see, sorry guys, I'm keeping an eye on the time. Did I start like how long ago? Like 3 minutes ago or something?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
You're good.
So I'm just looking for that one page 51. I'm operating like in a headache, so it's like a little tunnel. I have a little tunnel in here. So page 51, a key assumption that we have to question is that our thought is our own individual thought. Now, to some extent it is. We have some independence. But what is really going on when we're thinking? I'm trying to say that most of our thought in its general form is not individual. It originates in the whole culture and it pervades us. We pick it up as children from parents, from friends, from school, from newspapers, from books, and so on. We make a small change in it, we select certain parts of it which we like, and we may reject other parts. But still, it all comes from that pool. So, this brings us to John Dewey, who's always talking about layers of attention, layers of experience. And so educators in the room, like this would be part of general education curriculum, like if you were doing an education degree. I got it from a lovely old mentor of mine, and I just bought a new copy for this. So I got to spend money, because my old one was banged up. But Dewey's always talking about what we pay attention to and the habits and the attitudes that we form as people, that we start to be shaped by how we see, and we start to select what we see. So if you go into a field, and he mentions like law and medicine or stockbroker or any field you go into, you are then going to have more selective attention. You're going to pay attention to this and not that, and then you're in a community of others that you're doing that with. So that's really interesting to me to think of. With writers, of course, writers in the back are nodding. But all of us, all the time, who do we want to become, and how are we becoming that more and more each day? He talks about the formation of attitudes that are emotional and intellectual, sensitivities and ways of responding to all the conditions we meet in living. He notes that every experience leads to the next experience, and that we're changed. That person that's going into the next experience is changed by the previous experience. And with that, I will turn to Beloved, which my students, I'll ask them to kind of stay with me. This is exactly how I read. So what is happening in real time here, on my nightstand is like 5 things. So Beloved is a book that I read in high school. It came out when I was in high school. I did not read it in high school. Woe is us. I hope they put it in the curriculum now. But I worked at a bookstore after school, and so it was a bestseller for a long time. I was probably shelving it and like picked it up and took it home, right? She won a Pulitzer for it, and later a Nobel for her work. I read it probably every decade, and I forget it's good. I just forget it's really good, and then I'm like, oh wow. And this term I taught it, and it was kind of, her craft is so masterful. It's what element of craft do you even want to focus on? Her dialogue is superb, her sentence structure is superb. I mean, we could go anywhere. And what I chose to look at is her flashbacks and backstory, and how she seamlessly, in the middle of a paragraph, someone's standing in the kitchen, and you're back in a very sensory moment in the past. It is a book of an escaped slave woman, escaped heavily pregnant, and from horror to horror, heading into horror. And what I wanted to say about it was this book, what books can do, it's vicarious experience, especially if it's a skilled writer. So you are feeling and smelling and tasting what is happening. So it lets us kind of dip into an experience, that's not the right verb, but like to ghost an experience of the cruelty of slavery in America. It gets to the heart of material, because we're here with the chaplain, but like with material human life, flesh, blood, children. And that could even happen here, like the brutality of slavery. There's a scene I'll just read briefly. There's the wonderful characters, but Baby Suggs is the mother-in-law of the escaped Seth, the escaped slave. Baby Suggs rubbed her eyebrows. My firstborn. All I can remember of her is how she loved the burned bottom of bread. Can you beat that? 8 children, and that's all I remember. They're talking about like the law, because children would be ripped away and sold. You wouldn't know their name. You wouldn't dare name them. The next page, just to illustrate the backflash, she's out in the yard, the main character, and she says, the plash of water, the sight of her shoes and stockings awry on the path where she had flung them, or here boy lapping in the puddle near her feet, and suddenly there was Sweet Home rolling, rolling, rolling out before her eyes, and although there was not a leaf on that farm that did not make her want to scream, it rolled itself out before her in shameless beauty. It never looked as terrible as it was, and it made her wonder if hell was a pretty place too. Fire and brimstone and the most beautiful sycamores in the world. It shamed her, remembering the wonderful soughing trees rather than the boys. Try as she might to make it otherwise, the sycamores beat out the children every time, and she could not forgive her memory for that. I will close with one more thing from here. Not close yet, there's no books, but there's a character, Paul D, who's this wonderful, resilient character that at one point she calls a singing man. He's a man that sings. And he talks about saying more might push them both to a place they couldn't get back from. He would keep the rest where it belonged, in the tobacco tin buried in his chest, where a red heart used to be, its lid rusted shut. He would not pry it loose now in front of this sweet, sturdy woman, for if she got a whiff of the contents, it would shame him. And I'm going to come, so I'm looking at Andy now, but we can be raised to think that we should shut the door on the past, and I think this is because we don't have tools to process it. Veterans and others I know, my father is a veteran, and Andy recently gave a lovely talk on this very thing, but you need to be able to see it, to speak it, and to kind of digest it in loving community. And as a nation, I think we need to do more of that. So this comes back to On Dialogue, which is somewhere here. We need to live up to what we say we are. We need to be the home of the brave. We need to get ready and talk to each other and listen and hear each other. And to look at the hard and ugly places we've made and are still making, and to get together and hear each other. And we need to do that in all of our communities. This whole book On Dialogue is really about communication and community. That implies community. And here he says, but of course, such communication can lead to the creation of something new only if people are able freely to listen to each other without prejudice and without trying to influence each other. Dialogue, we make it into manipulation here. I mean, we debate each other, or we just like call it dialogue and then manipulate each other. But each has to be interested primarily in truth and coherence, so that he is ready to drop his old ideas and intentions and be ready to go on with something different together. So there we have Bohm again. So Beloved took us back to Bohm, and it's taking us forward to Unkindness, which I think Nicole could talk much more intelligently about. I have not read Western philosophy in 20 years, and this is filled with it, so you'd have a lot to say that would be really informative. Hi. But when I think of Beloved and I think of my 14-year-old self, I was kind of angry. And part of it was I couldn't figure out how we could do something like that here. In a place where we have this beautiful tenet to live by, to love thy neighbor. How does that even break down? And what this book tries to do is to answer that question. They actually, just to say, it's on kindness, and they say this is a historical story about how and why people have been talked out of their kindness, but also a psychological one. That is a story about how vulnerability becomes traumatic to people. Everybody is vulnerable at every stage of their lives. I mean, we hate that. We like to forget that. The growing old, the being a baby, and everything in between. Everybody is subject to illness, accident, personal tragedy, political and economic reality. This doesn't mean that people aren't also resilient and resourceful. Bearing other people's vulnerability, which means sharing in it imaginatively and practically without needing to get rid of it, to yank people out of it, entails being able to bear one's own. And I will close there later, and I'm hoping I'm 2:20.
You're
okay?
great. You're
Okay.
great.
So there's a couple really cool things that I wish what we should have done is had coffee, and then I would have. But there's some cool things about it here that is a bit lost on me because I haven't read Western philosophy in a long time. But there's moments where kindness got linked with self-sacrifice, and maybe St. Augustine did that, and linked it with self-sacrifice. So then it becomes like dismissible. We can't do that, okay? And there's moments in here of Adam Smith defending it, so it's kind of like of why it's for the good life. There were moments in which it was linked with women and feminized and then dismissed that way. There were moments it was linked with different sects of Christianity and dismissed that way. There's moments at which it becomes associated with sandal-wearing do-gooders, who sound like Jesus to me too. I mean, so what I wanted to kind of think of for a minute, there's so much in here that it was hard to select parts. But one thing that I think is really, we're in higher ed. We're here. We're readers. So a subtle and pervasive thought against kindness that kind of keeps us away from it is this here. Hang in there. It's this subtle idea that it's actually just some trick of selfishness actually. So and I'll just give an anecdote. Like you're in the copy room I was in the copy room at WashU, and there'd be someone like Andy, and I know Andy's a Pound scholar, and I just saw a book on Pound, but I'm gonna give it to you. I don't really know Andy, but it's like I saw this book on Pound. It was $1 and half price book here, and then there's this kind of like, what do you want? Kind of, what do you want? You must want something. Quid pro quo. I mean, right? Like there's some secret agenda, right? So it is now generally assumed that people are basically selfish, and that assumed. So back to Bohm. He's talking always about assumptions. It's generally assumed that people are basically selfish, and that fellow feeling is either a weakness, because that's the other thing. They'll think if you're nice, you're stupid. We've done that, right? Or a luxury, or a more sophisticated form of selfishness. All right? And there is a strange confusion here. On the one hand, we experience our feeling for others, our identification with others, people's sufferings and pleasures, as among our most immediate experiences, as though to feel for others is akin to an instinct or reflex. Think of when you've seen someone hurt physically. Like walking home one day and I saw a guy on a bike, bite it on the bike, and he's on the ground, and my stomach clenched. Like, you feel for others, right? But then we think we should not do that. We shouldn't do too much of that. And that's another point they make. They're kind of like, don't do too much of that. Like, you might break, you might lose your center, you might weaken yourself. So at its strongest, we have come to believe that feeling too much for others, being too sympathetic, either endangers our lives, right, in some way, or comfort, or is against our nature. And in a more insidious versions, we have come to suspect that the whole notion of kindness is a cover story. Indeed, our most subtly self-deceiving cover story for ingeniously ruthless self-interest. Fellow feeling is good as long as we don't have too much of it, and recognize that it isn't really fellow feeling at all. Religious people may still attach a great significance to it, but among the secular-minded, the case for kindness tends to be made only skeptically, with a knowing wink about the realities of human egotism, or egoism, sorry. So, I got preachy, and I'm sorry, you invited me, Nicole, but I just, it's like, I really refuse. It's kind of like, I was raised too, in a way, and my parents are great. I'm just saying the culture we're in, right, kind of raises you to go, yeah, that's true. Like, you should be a little careful, you shouldn't be too kind. And I don't believe that, and I don't want to. And I'm actually pretty old now. And since the recession, it's like, it's gotten worse. People, fear and aggression, and so I'm just not going to turn away. That doesn't mean I'm not horrible in traffic. FaceTime viewers, I'm terrible. But I just kind of want to just think about, that for a minute, these assumptions we have. And I will close. I'm going to wave in the air wide Sargasso Sea and only mention, it's so beautifully written, and it's set in Jamaica in like 1840s, and it's about a woman caught, she's not even caught between cultures, she's caught outside of two cultures. She's fallen on hard times, and it's Jane Eyre. Who read Jane Eyre? Mm-hmm. I did not. Why did I not? Because at 14 I read this, and it's about the mad woman in the attic. And so it's kind of like, I can't read it because, you know, this is the wife that was driven mad by the mean, and it turned out the husband's mean in this. He's very exploitative. But she is in an outside position, and that will take me to the final thing so that Nicole can speak. But, or no, not the second to final thing. So this book about outsiders, this is my book I buy for friends, and it was my Easter egg book. When I go in used bookstores, I would look for it, and then I give it to poor unsuspecting people, and then some of them come back and they're like, it's like a cult. Like the very few are like, oh my goodness, and then most of them just never mention it again. But it's set, I will read the back of I found it in India in a used bookstore. Born into the community, so it's a fantasy, you know, future. It's Charlie Mueller, Barb Mueller. Born into the community of truthful speakers, TS, capital. 1,000 years after the storm, capital S. He was raised on stories of the old days, a world filled with saints, a world in which all things were possible, a world which finally destroyed itself. And he goes on a journey. It's a very simple, very lyrical book. And what I think is really cool is that perspective of outsider, right? Because he's looking at us through the glass, fractured glass of centuries. So the main reason is I thought it was a beautiful book, but there's just, there's a lot of wisdom in the book, just everywhere in the book. I'm going to look at a couple things and then close with one thing. So it's a young boy too, so the other thing is writing from that child perspective. We talk about that in class a lot, but anything that's sort of outside and fresh and you get under the assumptions and you see things new. She looked at him in her dreamy, attentive way. Rush, she said, lives come in many shapes. Did you know that? There are lives that are like stairs and lives that are like circles. There are lives that start here and end there, and lives that start here and end the same. There are lives full of stuff and lives that will hold nothing. What shape is mine, he asked. So they tell stories of the saints, and these saints are not our saints. They are just flawed, like whatever they remembered of people that helped lead them out of the apocalyptic time. They're flawed people. This is what I want to show you about outsideness. It's kind of fun. So I won't ruin the book, but someone's asking him, no, go on. Was that all your education was, the stories about the saints? Oh no, there were other things. Painted Red told us stories about ancient times, long and fabulous stories impossible to remember all of, unless your memory is like a gossip's. The longest I remember her telling was called Money, capital M, and it went on for days and covered great stretches of time and was full of angles. It was hard to believe it was all true, but it was told by a truthful speaker, and there was proof, though not very oppressive for all the fantastic comings and goings and great powers of the stuff. It was just an oblong piece of paper, worn and limp like skin, with tiny figures all over it, and leaves, I think, and a face in the leaves. It looked magical for sure, but not something to die for, as Painted Red insisted so many had. So, fun to think of an outside perspective. And I will close, how am I?
You're great.
Okay,
You're great.
and I'll close right now. Good, we're right at 2:30, or 2:28.
You're good.
Okay. So I was given this book in my early 20s by a dear friend, and I haven't read it in a while. I have read other Hamlet children, and I have her audiobooks. She's really funny and has this kind of New York accent, and is very known for her honesty with herself and her humor about her families, right? So you're trying to be a good person, but then you're yelling in traffic. What's hilarious is I talk into my tape recorder often to compose things, and she'll be on, and then I'm yelling at people in traffic. There's lots of this audio, just in case you want to know that. So what she is known for is giving simple mindfulness tools to help people with things like, just worry or grief or anger or just whatever small things you're dealing with. She talks about ways to open our hearts to ourselves. So remember earlier I was talking about vulnerability and how you want to feel it with each other, but also yourself. Well, here, actually, I'm going back once and then forward and then I'm done. So a brief note from Unkindness, just to go back. See, I wanted this whole thing to be like imbricated, right, integrated. So page 110. Real kindness is not a magic trick. A conjuring away of every hateful or aggressive impulse. Yay, traffic, right? In favor of a selfless dedication to others. It is an opening up to others, in Rousseau's term, that enlarges us, and so gratifies our profoundly social natures, right? We're not in isolation. Maybe we sometimes wish we were, but we're not. We're never in isolation. So I'm going to read something from here, and then I've given you guys a handout, and I'll say what it says on there really briefly, but I'm just going to read something from here. The father of a 2-year-old talks about turning on the television and unexpectedly seeing the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. He watched as the firemen carried the limp and bloody bodies of toddlers from the ruins of the daycare center at the building's first floor. He says that in the past he was able to distance himself from other people's suffering, but since he's become a father, things have changed. He feels as if each of those children were his child. He feels the grief of all the parents as his own grief. This kinship with the suffering of others, this inability to continue to regard it from afar, is the discovery of our soft spot, is the discovery of Bodhichitta. Bodhichitta is a Sanskrit word that means noble or awakened heart. It is said to be present in all beings, just as butter is inherent in milk. You have to churn it though, right? You can't just, the milk just doesn't become butter, right? So you need to do stuff. We think that by protecting ourselves from suffering, we are being kind to ourselves. The truth is we only become more hardened, more fearful, more alienated. We experience ourselves as being separate from the whole. This separateness becomes like a prison for us, a prison that restricts us to our personal hopes and fears, and to caring only for the people nearest to us. And this was something really young, like I just didn't like. And like in my culture, like in the immediate culture I grew up in, it's kind of like, those aren't my kids, I'm not worried about them. It's kind of like, and my mind is kind of, how can they not be your kids? Like they're everyone's kids. So curiously enough, if we primarily try to shield ourselves from discomfort, we suffer. And I felt that even just being in India, like it would be dirty and hot, and I hate the heat anyway. And it was like the more I got tight and was like, I cannot stand this anymore. And you know this from our lives. The more you get like, my registration portal, right now. Sorry. I know people. But and you're like, if you start to get like, oh, my registration portal, it just, Gina's looking at me. But then you're in a tangle with your own headache, or you're in a tangle with your own thing. And what she does so well, it's an old practice. And I taught it at Maryville in the healthcare college, right? And I taught it to alumni, to faculty, nursing, and all those people. And it's just a simple breath practice. It's better on the spot. You can actually do it like right now together, but it's stopping that whole like pushing away your headache. And then also like sucking greedily up your chocolate, which I do both all the time. We're talking about it, right? But it's kind of like ventilating that where you think about others as well. And I wouldn't even say first, because some of us, especially women, can get very martyry. It's kind of like, it's easy for me to think about everyone else first, and then I won't sleep, but it's kind of, so you're including yourself, but instead of going, headache, blah, you're gonna actually kind of breathe in the headache. You're gonna notice it. John Dewey would appreciate that. You're actually having your present moment experience. He talks about how your life will not improve if you're not fully in your present moment. Don't sit there and plan all the time. Be in the moment. That's not Buddhist stuff. That's John Dewey. But the idea that I'm going to breathe in my headache, that's really radical, because it's really like, no, headache, go away. But if you were to kind of accept it, like you notice I'm having a headache and you accept it, and then I wish that Melissa just wouldn't have this. You could think of someone you like, or you could just go, I wish nobody would have to have this. Now, one 18-year-old that was half asleep once, and one of my was like, are you saying that like we're doing magic? I'm like, no, nobody's, like the headaches aren't ending everywhere. But it's just that attitude. It's that formation of an attitude that lightens your load. Here's the thing, if we want to be selfish, as they're saying, oh, we're secretly really just selfish. Well, then be selfish in a smart way. Ventilate your own headache, right? In the same way, there's neuroscience looking at savoring things, especially like people like veterans are picking up on this. But like, you stop and savor. Go downstairs, get a pumpkin latte. They're right down there, and you could notice you're drinking it. You savor that for a minute. You just really take it in, and then why not wish that other people have a little pleasure too? It just enlarges it, and it changes our crappy habits that we get into when we're feeling sorry, and then we get mad, and then we go on like that. So it's such a beautiful practice, and like there is a way to do it formally. I taught it in Maryville a few years, and we can sit and do this really it's breath work, and you can use the breath, but actually it's so much more powerful and like integrated on the spot. So do it in traffic today. I've got a headache today, so I can like play around with that. Go get a pumpkin latte, everyone, mocha, so you have permission, and take a savor, and then wish everybody that kind of joy, right? I'm gonna hand it over to a real preacher. It's hard being asked by the preacher. It's a little pressure.
Well, do you want to go, Nicole? Do you want to field questions? Or do you want to field questions at the end?
Yeah, that's some questions.
Okay.
Sorry.
Does anyone have questions for Gillian? That was great, Gillian. Thank you so much. But does anybody have questions during what I would call your popcorn session?
Yes.
Here's a kernel.
Yes.
Here's a kernel.
Here's the book to ignore, everyone. I'll still be your friend. I'll still respect you if you don't like the book.
Which one did you read first? Which was the
first book?
Beloved was
Sorry, this probably was
the Wide Sargasso Sea. Okay.
And then shortly after, because it came out shortly after.
Okay.
Right. And then this, I think I was in my late 20s and got really excited. And I've been geeking out like forever on that. And then there's my book. Oh, I love that book. And then this is really great. Stocking stuffer. Look, fits into stocking.
Yes.
Unkindness. With the coal, you can put it in there with all the coal. Like the coal and orange peels.
Well, I just had one quick question, and maybe your students can answer this as well. But when you teach, right, when you're giving content to your students, do you tend to do more fiction or more like what you've shown us today, nonfiction and fiction?
Yeah, they're fiction, so it's all fiction. Yeah, mostly. I throw in poems to get into pattern making and pattern breaking. So I drag them through some poems occasionally.
Craft articles.
And craft articles, yes. Teaching them to read as writers. So it's that how again. It's that how again.
I realized the prompts that you shared with us were more like visual, were essential. So what attracts you more, on choosing these books? Was it sensuality or the beauty of the
Oh,
language?
you mean the three fiction, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
The
The
prompts
three
that you
fiction,
shared.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, so remember young, right? Like 14 years old,
Yeah.
like reading all the time. But like, yeah, the language is beautiful. Honestly, like the language is beautiful. That's the truth of this book too. I just thought it was really beautiful. Like he
because
puts a
I
colon
remember
in an
the
interesting
class
way.
you were saying that when you read a piece, you do say to yourself whether, this is a writer, I can trust you. I remember you saying this.
Yeah.
So, but the prompts that you just shared were very sensual. So I just wondered whether it was the language or the sensuality that attracted you more.
Well, the two to me are one thing, right? Like, in so many ways. So it could be that the language is painting a sensory detail, or it could be that the sound of the vowels and the way they all click together and the punctuation is working is also sensual. So like I said, I couldn't show you this, I was frustrated, but there's a colon, he puts a colon in a moment, in a sentence in here in a really weird way, but it's really beautiful, I always think about it. But I didn't put it on the page, I didn't go that far with the paper. But yeah. Very musical, lyrical, yeah.
I have a comment, it's not really a question, but Stanley Fish writes about writing. He wrote a book, How to Write a Sentence, and in that he interviewed some authors and some painters, and he wants to find out why people chose their profession. He really broke it down to a real simple thing. He asked a painter, he says, how come you decided to be an artist? And the painter just said, I like the way paint smells.
Yeah.
And he asked a writer, how come you wanted to be a writer? And it's just exactly what you said. He said, I just like the way words go together.
Yeah.
It's the little things like that.
Yeah. And I think the last thing I'll say is if you study making anything, you study making everything, sort of. So it's kind of like, so that would be why I got interested in books on culture. I knew my students coming, if they came, it would be like, why aren't you talking about books on culture? But it's kind of like if you study how something's made, then you get interested in how things are made. Right? So, and I'm getting old, so you start to feel like you better broaden. Okay.
Thank you so much.
So I invited Jillian to join me in this because I knew that she would do this. that what you do is so very complimentary to what I do that I thought it would be really helpful to have you here. And I'm so grateful that you were willing to come and to talk about all of these great books, some of which I have read and have been so influential on me, and some that I'm going to be reading now and have them be influential to me. And so there'll be a list of all of these books up, and we should all read them. And before Jillian can hand you the book. So this is not, I've read thousands of books. Have you sat and ever thought about how many books you've read? Like, everybody in this room is kind of an academic. You are an academic. How many books have you read? Right, I flipped back through my Audible and my Kindle, and my Overwatch. So I use so these are just my audio books, and there are hundreds. And so over the course of my life, I've read a lot of books. So how do you pick one or two or three? I thought I was going to push it like talking about three. This is also one of the reasons why I invited Jillian. So how do you do that? And it really wasn't easy. But in that process of thought, it occurs to me that there are a couple that don't ever go away. That kind of always kind of come back to you. And so I decided to do this chronologically. The earliest one, the one that came back to me the earliest, is this one by Wilson Rawls. It's called Where the Red Fern Grows. And it was published in 1974. And I'm a little embarrassed because Jillian picked all of these amazingly lyrical, beautiful books. And Rawls writes for a young adult crowd, to be sure. And so there's not a whole lot of subtlety in his writing, let's say. This isn't the most subtle or lyrical writing in the world. It is deeply sentimental. So has anybody else read this, just by a show of hands, everybody else? Okay, so this is deeply sentimental. And did most of you guys read this when you were young-ish? Okay, all right. So I read it for the first time when I was 10. This is actually the original copy, so this is the book that my parents bought me when I was 10, and I've kept it with me. And so it is pretty dear to me, even if it's a little ham-fisted, I have to say. I hope Wilson Rawls isn't watching this. But maybe I am, because Mr. Rawls, you told a story that helped me define who I am. And so he tells the story of a boy, Billy, and his dogs, Old Dan and Little Ann. And it's a story, it's an American story set in the Missouri Ozarks. And I'm in Missouri and identify as a Missourian, so I was kind of hooked there at the beginning of this book. And then it's the story of a young boy who perseveres, who gets what he wants. So he wants a bunch of dogs, or he wants 2 dogs. He wants dogs to hunt with. And he can't have them because his family can't afford them. They're relatively poor from southern Missouri. So he works real hard selling fruit and bait to fishermen, and eventually he saves up enough money and he gives the money to his grandfather, who sends away for these 2 puppies, hunting dogs. And so he gets word that the puppies are here, but he can't, his family won't let him go into town and get them. And he's so excited to have these dogs that he sneaks out to town to go pick up his dogs. And I was kind of hooked, because, I like kids that disobey. I was a kid that disobeyed. I am a kid that disobeys. And so Billy runs into town and he gets his dogs. And while he's there, he gets teased by the kids in town because they have much more material possessions than he does. And he's one of these uneducated poor kids that lives back in the hollow. He defends himself and he takes the dogs and they head back out to his house way out in the woods, where Billy and his sisters are not getting an education, at least not a kind of school education. They're getting homeschooled by their mom, and their parents see this as a problem. Billy doesn't. And so Billy teaches his dogs how to hunt raccoons. And there's all sorts of adventures where they tree a coon, and then he gets into an adventure with one of the local bullies who says that his dogs are better, and so they go out hunting and together with the bully, and they tree this coon, and Billy refuses to kill it. And so he and the bully get into a fight about this because the bully wants to kill this raccoon. And Billy says no, and at the same moment then tension between the bully's dogs and Billy's dogs begin to rise, and there's a fight that ensues, and the bully ends up falling on his axe and dying. Yeah. Right. This is a kid's book. So Billy falls on his axe and dies. And there's much guilt over that in the end the kid fell on his own axe. So the story continues, and the dogs and Billy end up in a contest with a whole bunch of other like adults who have all of these thoroughbred dogs who have all of this gear and expertise, and the contest is worth $300 to see who can get the most raccoons in one night. And it's this harrowing story, and as the night falls, a blizzard sets in, and Grandpa that he's out hunting with sprains his ankle, and in the morning he finds the dogs covered in snow, and it just so happens that they treat their last coon. And so when you turn in the raccoons at the end of the morning, at the very last minute, Billy has won. Everybody's excited for him. He has $300 extra, and this is a lot of money for this family. And he gives it to Mom and Pa. And so life is getting good, and Mom and Pa are making their own plans, and Billy and the dogs are out hunting, and they get trapped by a cougar. And the dogs fight this big cat off, and in the process, old Dan dies. And little Ann can't live without him. And 2 days later, little Ann dies of a broken heart. And Billy makes boxes for his dogs. Zeus teared up a little bit too.
They have to read that part at home.
I'm going to read some of it. So Billy boxes up his animals and he buries them. And
Charlene's doing it too. Jeremy? Holding out?
Redford Gross board game.
So this is when he finds little Ann dead. He says, I found her lying on her stomach, her hind legs stretched out straight, her front feet folded back under her chest. She'd laid her head on his grave. I saw the trail where she dragged herself through the leaves. The way she laid there, I thought she was alive. I called her name and she made no movement. With the last ounce of strength in her body, she had dragged herself to the grave of old Dan. Kneeling down by her side, I reached out and touched her. There was no response, no whimpering cry or friendly wag of her tail. My little dog was dead. I laid her head in my lap and with tear-filled eyes gazed up into the heavens. In a choking voice, I asked, why did they have to die? Why must I hurt so? What have I done wrong? You've done no wrong, Billy, she said. This is his mom. I know this seems terrible, and I know how it hurts, but at one time or another, everyone suffered. Even the good Lord suffered while he was here on earth. I know, Mama, I said, but I can't understand. It was bad enough when old Dan died. Now little Ann is gone, both of them gone just like that. Billy, you haven't lost your dogs altogether, Mama said. You'll always have their memory. Besides, you can have more dogs. My little 10-year-old heart hated that woman. That is a terrible answer. So the story goes on. Papa came over and laid his hand on my shoulder. Billy, he said, there are times in a boy's life when he has to stand up like a man. Mr. Rawls, we need to have a talk about toxic masculinity. This is one of those times. I know what you're going through and how it hurts, but there's always an answer. The good Lord has a reason for everything he does. There couldn't be any reason for my dogs to die, Papa, I said. There just couldn't. They hadn't done anything wrong. Papa glanced at Mama. Getting no help from her, he said, it's cold out here. Let's go in the house. I have something to show you. And this is when Papa announces that the reason that Billy's dogs died is because they're going to be using the prize money to move into town so the kids can get an education. And now that the dogs are dead, they can bring Billy with them. Yep. There's a little redemption in there. Mama, I asked, do you think God made a heaven for all dogs? Yes, she said. I'm sure he did. this isn't the end. So they're about ready to move into town, and it's spring now. When I walked up close enough to see what it was, Billy's standing at the graves where he's buried his dogs. I sucked in a mouthful of air and stopped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There between the graves, a beautiful red fern had sprung up from the rich mountain soil. It was fully 2 feet tall, and its long red leaves had reached out in rainbow arches, curved over the graves of my dogs. I had heard the old Indian legend about how a red fern with a little Indian boy and girl were lost in a blizzard and had frozen to death. In the spring when they were found, a beautiful red fern had grown up between their 2 bodies. The story went on to say that only an angel could plant the seeds of a red fern, and that they never died. Where one grew, that spot was sacred. So, it wasn't just me that had problems with what Mama and Papa had to say. Billy did too. He did not at all like their response. And I loved Billy's refusal to be soothed by their platitudes, by their refusal to take his grief seriously, by their insistence on toxic masculinity. But what Rawls offers in that last scene is what the parents couldn't give. When Billy arrives at that grave the next spring to find that red fern growing there, Rawls lets the story do something that has always stuck with me. That life is marked by death. That death is, that it's painful, and that it doesn't make sense. And life is. And our deaths are marked by our lives. Our lives, the lives that we live, the good that we do, the hearts that we touch, these are enough. That God will mark them as sacred. They'll be remembered and cherished with a red fern. There's an answer there to the parents grappling with evil, with theodicy, that spoke to my little 10-year-old heart. Like, I don't want to hear about a vicious God who kills my dogs so my parents can drag me to town to get a good education. God killed my dogs. God won't give you anything more than what you can handle. Could I be a little less strong so my dogs would be happy? I'll be more than happy to be a little weaker, thanks God. But that's not what Rawls tells us. At the end, what Rawls tells us is that our lives are marked by God. They matter to God. So I got my call to ministry when I was about 14 years old. We've had a minister in my family every other generation since we have records. And so it was Christmas Day, and we'd all gathered at my family home. And I told my grandfather, who was still living, that this was it, that I was going to be a minister. And the joy in that man's face, the unabashed acceptance of who I am, and the love that he had for me and for what I would be doing and what it meant that I would be carrying on this family tradition won't go away. What he did, though, was remarkable. Every Christmas, part of our family tradition before we opened presents was to read the Bible, to read the Christmas story. And so he handed me the Bible that day, open to Luke. And he said that he would like me to read the Christmas story that day. I'm going to read it to you. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary, and he came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. Mary's great. She does a lot of pondering. I like that. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid." Also, if you ever meet an angel, that should be about the first thing they say, right? It's not an angel if the first thing they say doesn't include, "Don't be afraid." Also, angels are probably scary. Mary, do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus, and he will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. And Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" And the angel said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child who will be born will be holy, and he will be called the Son of God. And now your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has conceived a son, and this is the 6th month for her who was said to be barren. For nothing will be impossible with God." And then Mary said, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." And then the angel departed from her. And a few months after that, I confirmed the baptismal vows that my parents made for me, and I was given this verse out of Colossians chapter 4, verse 13. "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." So somewhere along the way, I got the idea that young girls could do anything. That Mary, a young girl and a virgin, could save the world. And maybe a young girl like me could do something too. And maybe I could be appalled with the way parents give platitudes. Maybe I could do things my own way and think about things in a different way. Maybe I didn't have to be the obedient girl. I mean, Mary was obedient to God, but she certainly was not obedient to her parents. She was not obedient to the rules of the day about how young girls were supposed to behave themselves. And so, with a God who cherishes me, who marks my story, and a Bible full of stories about women and girls who refuse to be good, I became a living nightmare for my parents. But I trooped off to college, and my senior year at Truman State University, just north of here, I took a class called Christianity. It was very simply titled, very straightforward. We've gotten fancy with our titles lately. I knew what class I was taking. Christianity, great, that's the class I'm gonna take. Thank you. I took a class on Christianity, and it was great. And at the very end of this kind of whirlwind tour of Christian theology, we read a couple of pages on this philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead. And it was a description about how the world works and who God is that was so intriguing to me that I went to the library after class. Thank God for libraries. I went to the library after class, and I found a copy of the unedited version of Process and Reality. Now, the edited version of Process and Reality is almost impossible to read. The unedited version is ridiculous. But I waded my way through Process and Reality and didn't understand much of it at all. But what I did know is that there is a way of looking at the world in this book that made sense of what I knew to be true of the world. That God marks our lives. That God cherishes all of us. And you said 100,000 things in your talk. That is what Process and Reality is. about accretion, about how the world comes together, not as Whitehead calls this the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that we are a thing, that you are a thing, and that thing has been the same thing that it's been since you were born, and that's simply not the case. You're not who you were when you were 2. I sincerely hope you're not who you are when you were 2-year-old. Although, what's the difference between a 2-year-old throwing a tantrum and a 62-year-old throwing a tantrum? 60 years. That's another old ministry joke. It might be a Deaning joke as well. So process and reality is a way of looking at the world developed by this guy, Lord Alfred North Whitehead. He was a mathematician, and he came to Harvard after the death of his son in World War I and started doing, originally started teaching at Harvard in math, and eventually started doing philosophy. And he developed what he calls the philosophy of organism, but what we tend to call process theology or process philosophy. And it's so technical and difficult to explain that I don't want to do too much with you. I've already talked about the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. I do want to talk about what he says, just briefly, talk about what he says about what he does. So he says the philosophy of organism, or process philosophy, is closely allied to Spinoza's scheme of thought, but it differs by the abandonment of subject-predicate forms of thought so far as concerns the presuppositions that this form is a direct embodiment of the most ultimate characterization of fact. Okay. I won't read too much of this for you. Whitehead is dense. He says, in all philosophic theory, there is an ultimate, which is actual in virtue of its accidents. It is only then capable of characterization through its accidental embodiments, and apart from these accidents is devoid of all actuality. In the philosophy of organism, this ultimate is termed creativity, and God is its primordial, non-temporal accident. The monistic philosophy, Spinoza, or absolute idealism, this ultimate is God, who is also equivalently termed the absolute. In such monistic schemes, the ultimate is illegitimately allowed a final, eminent reality beyond that ascribed to its accidents. He goes on to say, in this general position, the philosophy of organism seems to approximate more the strains of Indian or Chinese thought than the Western Asiatic or European thought. All right, so then it's another 300 pages on on a categorical scheme, on things like how the world comes into being. Since we're not the same as we were when we were 2 years old, how is it possible that we're different? Well, we're aggregates. Instead of being Spinoza's monads, these closed kind of islands of things, we're actually open windows. And each moment is an open window that allows in data from the past that we make into a present moment, which then becomes data for a next moment. We identify a person as that which holds together with some continuity, but you and I are intertwined now. God is also in that messy mix, this dance of life, of being and becoming, and being and becoming. He looks at the world as a process of change and growth, as opposed to a static thing, separate things bumping into each other. God gets to be part of that too. He has a lot of things to say. One of the things I want to say is the church, he's talking about the Christian church, gave unto God the attributes which belong exclusively to Caesar. He's making a pretty good, I think I'll put that over here. He's making a pretty good argument against some of the ways that religion or God has been looked at before. He goes on to say, the history of theistic philosophy exhibits various stages of combination of the diverse ways of entertaining the problem of who God is. There is, however, in the Galilean origin of Christianity, yet another suggestion which does not fit very well with these three main ways of looking at who God is. It does not emphasize the ruling Caesar, the ruthless moralist, or the unmoved mover. It dwells upon the tender elements of the world, which slowly, in quietness, operate by love. It finds purpose in the present immediacy of a kingdom not of this world. Love neither rules, nor is it unmoved. Also, it is a little oblivious to morals. It does not look to the future, for it finds its own reward in the immediate present. So, God is not to be treated as an exception to metaphysical principles. If the world works this way, God works in it. Viewed as primordial, he is the unlimited conceptual realization of absolute wealth of potentiality. In this aspect, he is not before all of creation, but is with all of creation. He says, God is the unconditioned actuality of conceptual feeling at the base of things that orders the relevance of eternal objects, the Platonic forms, in the process of creation. He is the lore for feeling. He says, God is also the principle of concretion, that principle whereby there is initiated a definite outcome from a situation, otherwise riddled with ambiguity. If everything that we are is a coming together of the past, how could we possibly do anything except repeat it? God comes in and puts a few limits in there, makes some things concrete. But God, as well as being primordial, is also consequent. He is the beginning and the end. He is the presupposed actuality of conceptual operation in unison with becoming, with every other creative act. The completion of God's nature into a fullness of physical feeling is derived from the objectification of the world in God. And I stood in front of that red fern with Billy. Let me read that again. The completion of God's nature into a fullness of physical feeling is derived from the objectification of the world in God. He shares with every new creation its actual world. And the concrescent creature is objectified in God as a novel element in God's objectification of the actual world. This prehension into God of each creature is directed with the subjective aim and clothed in the subjective form. Okay, so you didn't need that last sentence. But what Whitehead just said to us is part of God's nature is to take in the truth that everything of what we are, without flinching, without looking away, without covering over our sins and our faults, and loves it anyway. Not anyway, loves it. All of us. All of it. Warts and all. Now, part of God's good aim is to harmonize that beautifully in God. He goes on to say that the revolts of destructive evil, purely self-regarding, are dismissed into the triviality of merely individual facts. And yet the good they did achieve in individual joy, in individual sorrow, in the introduction of needed contrast, is yet saved by its relation to the completed whole. The image, and it is but an image, the image under which this operative growth of God's nature is best conceived, is that of a tender care that nothing be lost. The evil that we do in our lives isn't justified. The loss that we feel isn't made okay. becomes part of something bigger and greater, that over the course of time, God will wrestle into something that could be constructive if we will cooperate. So, I think I have to stop there. There's a lot more to read. It hit me, though, as I was reading Process and Reality for the first time, for the 50th time, that this is the story of a God which loses nothing that can be saved. And when I read it for the first time, I really was brought back to Billy standing there in front of that red fern. And what Rawls told me when I was 10, North Whitehead told me in my 20s, in my 30s, that there is a God who cherishes us, who cherishes everything about us. It doesn't necessarily condone the mistakes or the bad things that we do, but this is the God of second chances, over and over and over again. In process thought, our lives contribute to God's life. Not in a way that fundamentally changes what or who God is, but in a way, it changes the way God holds the world together, our faults and all, and makes our lives meaningful by that acceptance. Right? Because of God, we're never lost, we're always cherished, we're always in the eternal embrace of God's love and concern. And it seems to me that half of what you said, and so thank you.
Thank you.
Because I invited you because I was really hoping that you would do exactly what you did. Thank you, because Jillian did it better. Like, I did it
No, there's no
philosophy and Alfred North Whitehead in big, stupid words, and Jillian did it in 18 books that's like better.
No, it's how, but it's how, the how of it is interesting to watch. You know what you said, that you brought two books and the Bible, and then I brought all these books, but you said so much embodied in this accidents. There's things I want to get quotes from. You said we are actually open windows, and I'm just going to tell you the book that no one's going to read. It's got some weird, it actually has that, and I mean, it's really strange, really a lot of
There was a lot of
becoming
connection.
and continuum and all of that. We didn't have coffee beforehand.
And we're aggregates, and we haven't actually talked about this before. And so, but I'll make a plug for Process and Reality. If anybody wants to like do an independent study with me, I will more than happily read Process and Reality with you. And also, I'll bring a physicist in so that we can learn. Like, there's a chapter where Whitehead talks about why lines are straight, and I don't understand why lines are straight, but he does, and it has to do with perception. And so I'll have a physicist come and talk with us about why lines are straight, and then I'll do the rest. We can do it over coffee too.
Any questions for Nicole?